The morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range, casting long shadows across a landscape that seemed carved from granite and hardship. 3 years had passed since Eli McCall first set foot in this remote corner of Wyoming territory, and in that time, the wilderness had claimed pieces of him, softened edges that city living had left vulnerable, stripped away pretenses that civilization demanded. What remained was something elemental, something that belonged to this place, as much as the lodgepole pines and the grey wolves that howled at the winter moon. His cabin sat in a natural clearing, a modest structure built from timber he'd felled. Himself, chinked with mud and moss, its single window facing east toward the sunrise. Smoke curled from the stone chimney he'd labored over for 2 weeks that first autumn, when the cold had come early and fierce. The roof was sod and timber, thick enough to shed the mountain snows that could bury a man's dreams along with his dwelling. It wasn't much to look at, but it was solid, built to last, built by hands that had learned the value of permanence the hard way. Eli stepped onto the rough-hewn porch, coffee steaming in a tin cup that had seen better decades. At 42, he carried himself with the measured movements of a man who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered. His frame was lean but strong, muscles corded from years of splitting wood, hauling water, and wrestling a living from land that gave up nothing easily. His dark hair had begun its retreat from his temples, and lines bracketed his eyes, some from squinting into mountain sun, others from sorrows he'd never named aloud. The morning ritual was always the same. Check the snares he'd set along the creek bottom. Tend to his small garden plot where hardy vegetables grew in the brief mountain summer. Split kindling for the day's fires. Mend whatever needed mending, and in this country, something always needed mending. The wilderness demanded constant vigilance, constant work, constant attention to the 1,000 small details that meant the difference between comfort and misery, between life and death. He pulled on his worn leather boots, the same pair he'd bought in Cheyenne 3 years ago when he'd first headed into the mountains. They'd been stiff and unforgiving then, city-made things that had rubbed blisters on his heels for the first month. Now they fit like old friends, supple and familiar, bearing the scars of rocky trails and creek crossings, of long days spent walking fence lines that existed only in his mind. The hand-forged lock on his cabin door caught the morning light as he turned the key. He'd made that lock himself during the long winter nights of his second year, when the snow had piled higher than the windows and the silence had grown so complete it seemed to have weight. Working the metal had given his hands something to do, his mind something to focus on, besides the memories that stalked him in the darkness. The lock was crude but functional, fashioned from iron he'd salvaged from an abandoned mine shaft 20 miles to the south. It served its purpose, keeping out the occasional curious bear or wandering elk, though, truth be told, visitors of any kind were rarer than hen's teeth in this remote valley. He walked the familiar path to the creek, his storm carved, walking stick tapping against the stones. He'd found the wood 2 summers ago, a piece of mountain ash that lightning had twisted into something almost artistic. The wilderness had a way of creating beauty from violence, he'd learned. Sometimes the most beautiful things were born from the worst storms. The creek ran clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from peaks that touched the sky. Eli knelt beside the water, cupping it in his hands to drink. It tasted of stone and sky, of distance and solitude. This was his communion, his daily reminder of where he belonged now, not among the noise and bustle of civilization, but here, where a man could hear his own thoughts without them being drowned out by the wants and needs of others. His snares had yielded a fat rabbit, enough meat for several days if he was careful. He reset the trap with practiced efficiency, his fingers moving through the motions without conscious thought. Survival had become instinct, each skill learned through necessity and honed through repetition. He could read weather in the behavior of birds, predict storms by the ache in his joints, find water by the color of distant vegetation. The knowledge had been bought with loneliness, paid for with isolation, but it was his now, part of him as surely as the scars on his hands or the weight in his chest. Walking back toward the cabin, he paused to examine his small garden. The growing season was nearly over, the last of the potatoes ready for harvest. He'd learned to grow what would keep, root vegetables that could survive in his crude root cellar, beans that dried well, herbs that could be preserved through the winter months. It wasn't much, but combined with what he could hunt and trap, it was enough. Enough to survive, enough to endure, enough to maintain the careful balance he'd built between himself and this unforgiving land. Inside the cabin, shadows danced across walls chinked with clay and moss. The single room served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom, every inch put to practical use. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by 3 years of constant use. Shelves lined the walls, holding the sparse necessities of frontier life: tins of salt and sugar, ammunition for his rifle, tools wrapped in oiled cloth, books whose pages had yellowed with mountain air and time. Eli moved through his morning routine with the precision of ritual. Coffee beans ground by hand in a small mill he'd traded for in a mining camp 50 miles south. Water heated in a kettle that had seen service in 2 different wars before finding its way to his hearth. Bacon fried in a cast-iron pan that weighed nearly as much as a saddle, but would outlast him by decades. These simple tasks anchored him to the present, kept his mind from wandering down paths that led nowhere good. But sometimes, despite his best efforts, the past would surface unbidden. Like now, as he reached for the tin of coffee, his fingers brushed against the small wooden box he kept hidden behind the flour sack. His hand jerked back, as if the wood had burned him. But it was too late. The memories were already stirring, like sediment disturbed in still water. He tried to focus on the bacon crackling in the pan, on the coffee beginning to bubble in the pot, on anything but that box and what it contained. But the cabin seemed smaller suddenly, the walls closer, and he could almost hear her voice calling his name across the years. "Eli, come look at this sunset. Have you ever seen anything so beautiful?" Sarah. Her name was a whisper in his mind, barely formed, as if speaking it even in thought might summon ghosts he'd worked so hard to lay to rest. 3 years in the mountains, 3 years of silence and solitude, and still her memory could ambush him with the efficiency of a seasoned hunter. He poured coffee into his tin cup with hands that had only the slightest tremor, a tremor that would have been invisible to anyone else, but felt like an earthquake to him. The coffee was bitter and black, the way he'd learned to take it after Sarah died. She'd always sweetened hers with honey and cream, making faces at him when he drank his. "Straight, how can you taste anything but burnt beans?" she'd asked, laughing, and he'd told her that was the point. Sometimes a man needed to taste the bitter to appreciate the sweet. Now there was only bitter, and that seemed fitting. The faded daguerreotype remained hidden in its box, but he could see it clearly in his mind's eye. Sarah in her Sunday dress, the blue one with the small flowers that brought out her eyes. She was smiling, one hand raised to keep her hat from blowing away in the prairie wind. He'd taken that photograph the day before he'd asked her father for her hand in marriage, wanting to capture her just as she was, young and beautiful and full of hope for their future together. That future had lasted exactly 11 months and 3 days. The fever had taken her in the spring of their first year of marriage, along with the child she'd been carrying. Eli had held her hand through those final days, watching helplessly as the light faded from her eyes, listening to her, whispered promises that they'd see each other again someday, somewhere beyond the reach of sickness and sorrow. When it was over, when the preacher had said his words and the earth had covered her grave, Eli had sold everything they'd owned and headed west, carrying nothing but his grief and his rifle and the daguerreotype he couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bring himself to destroy. The mountains had seemed like the right place for a man who no longer fit among the living. Here, surrounded by peaks that had stood for millennia, his pain felt smaller, more manageable. The wilderness didn't ask questions, didn't offer empty condolences, didn't expect him to move on or heal or any of the other things well-meaning folks had suggested. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, offering solace to those who sought it and challenges to those who needed them. He'd thought he'd found peace in this remote valley. The work was hard but satisfying, the solitude complete but not oppressive. Days passed without him speaking a word aloud. Weeks went by, marked only by the changing weather and the slow turn of seasons. He'd convinced himself that this was enough, that a man could build a life from routine and silence and the simple satisfaction of surviving another day. But now, with winter approaching and the memory of Sarah's voice still echoing in the cabin's stillness, he wondered if he'd been fooling himself all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range, casting long shadows across a landscape that seemed carved from granite and hardship. 3 years had passed since Eli McCall first set foot in this remote corner of Wyoming territory, and in that time, the wilderness had claimed pieces of him, softened edges that city living had left vulnerable, stripped away pretenses that civilization demanded. What remained was something elemental, something that belonged to this place, as much as the lodgepole pines and the grey wolves that howled at the winter moon. His cabin sat in a natural clearing, a modest structure built from timber he'd felled. Himself, chinked with mud and moss, its single window facing east toward the sunrise. Smoke curled from the stone chimney he'd labored over for 2 weeks that first autumn, when the cold had come early and fierce. The roof was sod and timber, thick enough to shed the mountain snows that could bury a man's dreams along with his dwelling. It wasn't much to look at, but it was solid, built to last, built by hands that had learned the value of permanence the hard way. Eli stepped onto the rough-hewn porch, coffee steaming in a tin cup that had seen better decades. At 42, he carried himself with the measured movements of a man who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered. His frame was lean but strong, muscles corded from years of splitting wood, hauling water, and wrestling a living from land that gave up nothing easily. His dark hair had begun its retreat from his temples, and lines bracketed his eyes, some from squinting into mountain sun, others from sorrows he'd never named aloud. The morning ritual was always the same. Check the snares he'd set along the creek bottom. Tend to his small garden plot where hardy vegetables grew in the brief mountain summer. Split kindling for the day's fires. Mend whatever needed mending, and in this country, something always needed mending. The wilderness demanded constant vigilance, constant work, constant attention to the 1,000 small details that meant the difference between comfort and misery, between life and death. He pulled on his worn leather boots, the same pair he'd bought in Cheyenne 3 years ago when he'd first headed into the mountains. They'd been stiff and unforgiving then, city-made things that had rubbed blisters on his heels for the first month. Now they fit like old friends, supple and familiar, bearing the scars of rocky trails and creek crossings, of long days spent walking fence lines that existed only in his mind. The hand-forged lock on his cabin door caught the morning light as he turned the key. He'd made that lock himself during the long winter nights of his second year, when the snow had piled higher than the windows and the silence had grown so complete it seemed to have weight. Working the metal had given his hands something to do, his mind something to focus on, besides the memories that stalked him in the darkness. The lock was crude but functional, fashioned from iron he'd salvaged from an abandoned mine shaft 20 miles to the south. It served its purpose, keeping out the occasional curious bear or wandering elk, though, truth be told, visitors of any kind were rarer than hen's teeth in this remote valley. He walked the familiar path to the creek, his storm carved, walking stick tapping against the stones. He'd found the wood 2 summers ago, a piece of mountain ash that lightning had twisted into something almost artistic. The wilderness had a way of creating beauty from violence, he'd learned. Sometimes the most beautiful things were born from the worst storms. The creek ran clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from peaks that touched the sky. Eli knelt beside the water, cupping it in his hands to drink. It tasted of stone and sky, of distance and solitude. This was his communion, his daily reminder of where he belonged now, not among the noise and bustle of civilization, but here, where a man could hear his own thoughts without them being drowned out by the wants and needs of others. His snares had yielded a fat rabbit, enough meat for several days if he was careful. He reset the trap with practiced efficiency, his fingers moving through the motions without conscious thought. Survival had become instinct, each skill learned through necessity and honed through repetition. He could read weather in the behavior of birds, predict storms by the ache in his joints, find water by the color of distant vegetation. The knowledge had been bought with loneliness, paid for with isolation, but it was his now, part of him as surely as the scars on his hands or the weight in his chest. Walking back toward the cabin, he paused to examine his small garden. The growing season was nearly over, the last of the potatoes ready for harvest. He'd learned to grow what would keep, root vegetables that could survive in his crude root cellar, beans that dried well, herbs that could be preserved through the winter months. It wasn't much, but combined with what he could hunt and trap, it was enough. Enough to survive, enough to endure, enough to maintain the careful balance he'd built between himself and this unforgiving land. Inside the cabin, shadows danced across walls chinked with clay and moss. The single room served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom, every inch put to practical use. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by 3 years of constant use. Shelves lined the walls, holding the sparse necessities of frontier life: tins of salt and sugar, ammunition for his rifle, tools wrapped in oiled cloth, books whose pages had yellowed with mountain air and time. Eli moved through his morning routine with the precision of ritual. Coffee beans ground by hand in a small mill he'd traded for in a mining camp 50 miles south. Water heated in a kettle that had seen service in 2 different wars before finding its way to his hearth. Bacon fried in a cast-iron pan that weighed nearly as much as a saddle, but would outlast him by decades. These simple tasks anchored him to the present, kept his mind from wandering down paths that led nowhere good. But sometimes, despite his best efforts, the past would surface unbidden. Like now, as he reached for the tin of coffee, his fingers brushed against the small wooden box he kept hidden behind the flour sack. His hand jerked back, as if the wood had burned him. But it was too late. The memories were already stirring, like sediment disturbed in still water. He tried to focus on the bacon crackling in the pan, on the coffee beginning to bubble in the pot, on anything but that box and what it contained. But the cabin seemed smaller suddenly, the walls closer, and he could almost hear her voice calling his name across the years. "Eli, come look at this sunset. Have you ever seen anything so beautiful?" Sarah. Her name was a whisper in his mind, barely formed, as if speaking it even in thought might summon ghosts he'd worked so hard to lay to rest. 3 years in the mountains, 3 years of silence and solitude, and still her memory could ambush him with the efficiency of a seasoned hunter. He poured coffee into his tin cup with hands that had only the slightest tremor, a tremor that would have been invisible to anyone else, but felt like an earthquake to him. The coffee was bitter and black, the way he'd learned to take it after Sarah died. She'd always sweetened hers with honey and cream, making faces at him when he drank his. "Straight. How can you taste anything but burnt beans?" she'd asked, laughing, and he'd told her that was the point. Sometimes a man needed to taste the bitter to appreciate the sweet. Now there was only bitter, and that seemed fitting. The faded daguerreotype remained hidden in its box, but he could see it clearly in his mind's eye. Sarah in her Sunday dress, the blue one with the small flowers that brought out her eyes. She was smiling, one hand raised to keep her hat from blowing away in the prairie wind. He'd taken that photograph the day before he'd asked her father for her hand in marriage, wanting to capture her just as she was, young and beautiful and full of hope for their future together. That future had lasted exactly 11 months and 3 days. The fever had taken her in the spring of their first year of marriage, along with the child she'd been carrying. Eli had held her hand through those final days, watching helplessly as the light faded from her eyes, listening to her, whispered promises that they'd see each other again someday, somewhere beyond the reach of sickness and sorrow. When it was over, when the preacher had said his words and the earth had covered her grave, Eli had sold everything they'd owned and headed west, carrying nothing but his grief and his rifle, and the daguerreotype he couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bring himself to destroy. The mountains had seemed like the right place for a man who no longer fit among the living. Here, surrounded by peaks that had stood for millennia, his pain felt smaller, more manageable. The wilderness didn't ask questions, didn't offer empty condolences, didn't expect him to move on or heal or any of the other things well-meaning folks had suggested. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, offering solace to those who sought it and challenges to those who needed them. He'd thought he'd found peace in this remote valley. The work was hard but satisfying, the solitude complete but not oppressive. Days passed without him speaking a word aloud. Weeks went by, marked only by the changing weather and the slow turn of seasons. He'd convinced himself that this was enough, that a man could build a life from routine and silence and the simple satisfaction of surviving another day. But now, with winter approaching and the memory of Sarah's voice still echoing in the cabin's stillness, he wondered if he'd been fooling himself all along. The barometric glass on Eli's mantelpiece had been dropping steadily for 2 days, its mercury falling like a stone through water. He'd traded a month's worth of pelts for that instrument 3 winters ago, and it had proven worth every beaver skin. In country where weather could kill you faster than a rattlesnake, knowing what was coming meant the difference between preparedness and catastrophe. Today the glass read low enough to make him uneasy. The air itself felt heavy, pregnant with moisture and electricity. Even the wildlife sensed it. The usual chatter of squirrels and jays had given way to an ominous quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The horses down in the valley had been restless for days, and the few remaining birds flew with the urgent purpose of creatures racing against time. Eli stood on his porch, studying the sky with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read nature's moods. Clouds massed along the western peaks like a grey army preparing for battle. They had the heavy, dark look of snow clouds, but it was still early November, too early for the kind of storm that those formations promised. Yet the signs were unmistakable, and Eli had learned long ago not to argue with the weather. He spent the morning in a flurry of preparation that would have seemed excessive to a city dweller, but was merely prudent to a mountain man. Wood split and stacked until his pile reached nearly to the eaves of his cabin. Water barrels filled from the creek and hauled close to the door. His root cellar checked and rechecked, ensuring that his stores of potatoes, carrots, and dried meat were secure and accessible. The last of his garden harvested and stored, even the green tomatoes that might ripen indoors if the storm lasted long enough. His rifle cleaned and loaded, ammunition counted and stored where he could reach it quickly. Not that he expected trouble. From human sources, this valley was too remote, too difficult to reach for casual visitors, but storms had a way of driving desperate animals to desperate measures, and a hungry bear or mountain lion could be just as dangerous as any human threat. As the day wore on, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of snow. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Eli could feel the approaching storm in his bones, in the old bullet wound in his shoulder that ached whenever the weather changed. That wound was a souvenir from his army days, a memento from a cavalry. A charge gone wrong on some forgotten battlefield, whose name he couldn't even remember now. The pain had faded over the years, but the sensitivity to weather remained, more reliable than any barometer. By afternoon, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, drifting down like ash from a distant fire. They melted as soon as they touched the ground, but Eli knew that wouldn't last long. The temperature was dropping fast, and the clouds overhead promised much more than a gentle dusting. This had the look of a real blizzard, the kind that could bury a cabin for days and turn the familiar landscape into an alien world of white. He brought in extra firewood, enough to last a week if he was careful. The thought of being trapped indoors for that long didn't particularly disturb him. He'd endured worse in his years of solitude, and he had books to read, tools to maintain, and the endless small tasks that filled a mountain man's days. Solitude was his companion now, as familiar and reliable as his morning coffee or his evening pipe. The wind picked up as darkness fell, howling through the pines with increasing fury. Snow began to fall in earnest now, thick flakes that stuck to everything they touched and accumulated with alarming speed. Eli banked his fire carefully, ensuring it would burn steady through the night, and settled into his chair with a book. Of poetry he'd read dozens of times before. The words were familiar friends now, offering comfort without demanding attention. Outside, the storm raged with the fury of something primal and untamed. The wind screamed around the cabin's corners, rattling the door and making the single window flex in its frame. Snow hissed against the glass like thrown sand, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sharp crack of tree branches breaking under the weight of ice and wind. This was the wilderness at its most honest, beautiful and terrible, offering no quarter to the unprepared or the unlucky. Eli had learned to respect its power, to prepare for its moods, to survive its tests. Tonight would be another test, another trial to be endured with patience and wisdom, earned through hard experience. He had no way of knowing that before the storm ended, his carefully ordered world would be turned upside down by a stranger whose desperation matched the fury of the wind outside. The sound came sometime after midnight, barely audible above the storm's fury. At first, Eli thought it was just the wind playing tricks, a branch scraping against the cabin wall perhaps, or snow sliding off the roof. But there it was again, more distinct this time. A rhythmic thumping, too regular to be natural, too urgent to be accidental. Someone was pounding on his door. Eli set down his book and listened intently, every sense suddenly alert. In 3 years of mountain living, no one had ever come to his cabin uninvited. The nearest settlement was 40 miles away, across terrain that was treacherous in good weather and nearly impassable in a blizzard like this. For someone to be out in this storm, they'd have to be running from something worse than freezing to death. The pounding came again, weaker now, almost desperate. Eli rose from his chair and moved to the window, peering out into the swirling white chaos. He could barely see beyond the porch rail, but there was definitely something huddled against his door, a dark shape that moved with the feeble motions of someone on the very edge of collapse. His hand went instinctively to the rifle propped beside the fireplace. Caution was a hard-learned lesson in this country, and trust was a luxury that could get a man killed. But as he reached for the weapon, another sound stopped him cold, a voice high and thin, calling out through the storm. "Please, help me." The voice was unmistakably female, carrying notes of exhaustion and terror that cut through his wariness like a blade. Eli had heard that same desperate edge in voices before, during the war, when wounded soldiers called out in the darkness for help that might never come. It was the sound of someone who had reached the absolute end of their endurance. He unlatched the heavy wooden bar that secured his door and pulled it open against the wind's resistance. Snow swirled into the cabin as a figure collapsed across. His threshold, a woman wrapped in what had once been a fine woolen cloak, now torn and sodden with snow and ice. Her dark hair hung in frozen strands around a face that was pale as carved marble. lips blue with cold, eyes barely conscious but still holding a spark of fierce determination. She was young, perhaps 25, with delicate features that spoke of a sheltered upbringing far from the harsh realities of frontier life. But those features were marred now by exhaustion and exposure, by the kind of desperate flight that left its mark on body and soul alike. Her clothes, what he could see of them beneath the ruined cloak, were well made, but completely unsuited for mountain weather. A traveling dress of fine fabric that might have been appropriate for a railway car, but was worse than useless against a Wyoming blizzard. As he knelt beside her, something caught his eye. A torn piece of blue ribbon tangled in her hair, the silk bright against the dark strands, despite being stained with what looked like blood. The ribbon was expensive, the kind of thing a lady might wear to a society function, and its presence here in this remote wilderness seemed as incongruous as finding a rose blooming in a snowdrift. "Ma'am," he kept his voice gentle, the way he'd spoken to spooked horses or wounded animals. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on his face with obvious effort. They were grey, he noticed, the color of storm clouds over distant mountains, and they held an intelligence that shone through despite her exhaustion. "Safe," she whispered, the word barely audible above the wind. "You're safe," he told her, and meant it. Whatever had driven her out into this storm, whatever she was running from, it would have to wait. Right now, she needed warmth and shelter, and those were things he could provide. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was, how fragile she felt in his arms. She couldn't weigh more than 100 pounds soaking wet, and that's exactly what she was. Her clothes were frozen to her skin in places, and he could feel her shivering even through the layers of wool and cotton. Kicking the door shut behind him, Eli carried her to the chair closest to the fire, his mind already racing through what needed to be done. Dry clothes, warm blankets, hot food, the basics of survival that would determine whether this stranger lived to see morning. Eli worked with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd seen his share of emergencies. First priority was getting her out of the frozen clothes before hypothermia claimed her. He kept his eyes averted as much as possible while peeling away layers of ice-stiffened fabric, his movements clinical and respectful. Underneath the ruined traveling dress, he found a woman who bore the unmistakable signs of hard travel and harder choices. Bruises on her wrists that looked suspiciously like finger marks, scratches on her arms from thorns or branches, and a nasty cut on her temple that explained the blood on her ribbon. His medical kit was crude but serviceable, assembled from supplies he'd gathered over 3 years of mountain living. Bandages made from torn shirts, salve concocted from pine pitch, and wild herbs, thread for stitches that he'd hoped never to use on anything larger than a torn coat. But his hands remembered skills learned during the war, when field medicine had meant the difference between life and death for too many young soldiers who'd never see home again. He cleaned the cut on her temple with careful precision, noting how she flinched even in her semi-conscious state. The wound was fresh, probably no more than a day old, and it had bled freely before the cold had slowed the flow. Someone had struck her, and recently. The knowledge settled in his gut like a cold stone, raising questions he wasn't sure he wanted. Answered, "Don't, please don't," she murmured as he worked, her voice thick with exhaustion and fear. Her eyes moved beneath closed lids, chasing nightmares that seemed more real than the warmth and safety of his cabin. "Easy now," he said softly, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he'd used with wounded soldiers. "You're safe. No one's going to hurt you here." His words seemed to reach her even in her delirium. Her breathing steadied slightly, and some of the tension left her features. Eli wrapped her in his warmest blankets and moved her closer to the fire, then set about preparing the kind of nourishment that might coax life back into her frozen body. Beef broth simmered on the stove, rich with fat and salt, the kind of restorative that could bring someone back from the edge of death. He'd learned its value during the war, when good soup had saved more lives than all the medicine in the surgeon's tent. As it heated, he found himself studying his unexpected guest with the wary attention of a man who'd learned that strangers often brought trouble in their wake. Her hands drew his particular notice. They were soft, unmarked by calluses or scars, with nails that had been recently manicured despite the ordeal she'd endured. These were not the hands of a frontier woman, not the hands of someone accustomed to hard work or harsh conditions. They belonged to a lady, someone who'd known comfort and privilege before whatever circumstances had driven her out into the wilderness. The blue ribbon lay on his table where he'd placed it after untangling it from her hair. In the firelight, he could see that it was silk, probably imported, certainly expensive. The bloodstains didn't hide the quality of the material or the careful way it had been crafted. This was no simple hair decoration, but something that spoke of wealth and position, of a life lived far from the hardships that marked most frontier existence. When she began to stir more purposefully, her eyes opening to focus on the unfamiliar surroundings, Eli saw intelligence there, and fear. She took in the cabin's sparse furnishings, his weathered face, the rifle still propped within easy reach, and he could almost see her mind working, cataloguing potential threats and escape routes. Where? Her voice was hoarse, barely above, a whisper. Where am I? My cabin, he said simply, in the Wind River Range. You came here during the storm, near frozen to death. She struggled to sit up, wincing at what must have been a dozen different pains. How long have I been? Few hours. It's still snowing hard out there. He ladled broth into a cup and approached slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal. You need to drink this. Get some warmth back in your bones. Her eyes never left his face as she accepted the cup, and he could see the questions forming behind her careful composure. Soon she'd want answers he wasn't sure he could give, and she'd have questions he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Dawn brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind had intensified during the night, driving snow against the cabin walls with the persistence of something alive and angry. Eli woke from his chair by the fire to find his guest sitting upright on his narrow bed, wrapped in blankets, and studying him with those grey eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. You stayed awake all night, she observed, her voice stronger now but still carrying traces of exhaustion. Seemed prudent. He stretched muscles stiff from sleeping in the chair, noting how she tensed at his movement. Didn't know if you'd taken a chill to the brain, or if that knock on your head was worse than it looked. She touched the bandage on her temple gingerly. You doctored me. Some. He moved to the stove, adding wood to coax the coals back to life. Nothing fancy. Cleaned the cut, got you warmed up. You were half froze when you got here. In the growing light, he could see her more clearly, and what he saw only deepened his puzzlement. Her hair, now dry and freed from ice, was the rich brown of good coffee, and it fell in waves that spoke of careful tending despite her ordeal. Her features were refined, aristocratic even, with high cheekbones and a straight nose that belonged in a portrait gallery rather than a mountain cabin. But it was her bearing that truly set her apart. Even wrapped in his rough wool blankets, even after nearly dying in a blizzard, she carried herself with an unconscious dignity that couldn't be learned or faked. This was a woman born to privilege, raised in comfort, educated in the gentle arts that marked the upper classes. I should thank you, she said carefully. You saved my life. Maybe. He busied himself with the coffee, uncomfortable with gratitude. That felt premature. Storms still raging, too early to know if any of us are saved yet. She fell silent at that, and he could feel her watching him as he moved through his morning routine. When he finally turned back to her, coffee steaming in his cup, he found her examining a pair of fine leather gloves that must have fallen from her cloak. The leather was supple and unmarked, clearly expensive, with tiny pearl buttons at the wrists that would have cost more than most folks saw in a month. You're wondering who I am, she said, not looking up from the gloves. Wondering. What you're running from. The words came out harder than he'd intended. sharpened by years of solitude and a natural suspicion of complications. "Don't get many ladies out this way, especially not in traveling clothes worth more than my cabin." She looked up at that, meeting his gaze directly. "My name is Clara Byrne." The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it suggested it should. There was weight behind those syllables, the kind of significance that came with family reputation and social standing. "Boston?" he guessed, noting the faint accent that marked her speech. "Yes?" Surprise flickered across her features. "How did you heard enough educated folks to recognize the sound?" He poured a second cup of coffee and offered it to her. "Question is, what brings a Boston lady to the Wyoming wilderness in the middle of winter?" She accepted the coffee with hands that trembled slightly, whether from cold or nerves he couldn't tell. When she spoke, her words were measured, carefully chosen. "I was traveling west. The stagecoach there was an accident. In the storm." It was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. Eli had heard enough false stories to recognize the careful cadence of someone editing their words as they spoke. But he also recognized the fear behind the lie, the kind of bone-deep terror that made truth feel more dangerous than deception. "Bad country for traveling this time of year," he said neutrally. "Especially alone." "I wasn't alone." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and he saw her immediately regret the admission. "That is, there were other passengers who didn't make it to my door." She looked down at her coffee, and he could see her struggling with how much to reveal. "No, they didn't." The silence stretched between them, filled with the howling of wind and the weight of unspoken truths. Eli found himself caught between irritation and sympathy, between his desire for solitude and an unexpected protectiveness toward this frightened stranger who'd brought complications to his carefully ordered world. "Well," he said finally, "storms. Likely to last another day or two, maybe longer. You'll stay here until it passes." It wasn't really a question, and they both knew it. Outside, the wind screamed like something wild and wounded, and the snow fell with the relentless fury of winter. Unleashed, whatever Clara Byrne was running from, it would have to wait. The mountains had claimed her now, and the mountains kept their own schedule. The second day brought a subtle shift in the dynamics between them. Clara had found her strength, and with it, a quiet dignity that filled the small cabin with an unexpected grace. She insisted on helping with the meals, despite Eli's protests, her movements around his simple kitchen revealing both unfamiliarity with rough conditions and a determined adaptability that surprised him. "You don't have to," he began as she carefully stirred the pot of beans he'd set to simmer. "I'm not accustomed to being idle," she interrupted gently, "and I've imposed on your hospitality quite enough without acting like a helpless ornament." There was steel beneath the refined manners, he realized. Whatever had driven her into the wilderness, she hadn't survived it through delicacy alone. As he watched her work, he noticed the careful way she moved, as if testing her limits, and the occasional wince that suggested her ordeal had left more marks than the visible ones. When she reached for the salt, her sleeve pulled back to reveal more of those finger-shaped bruises on her wrist. The marks were turning from purple to yellow-green, following the familiar progression of healing that told him they were several days old. Someone had grabbed her, hard enough to leave lasting marks, and the knowledge stirred something protective in him that he'd thought long buried. "You read," Clara observed, nodding toward the shelf of books that lined one wall of the cabin. "Some." He was surprised by the question. Most folks out here considered books a luxury, if they considered them at all. "Helps pass the winter nights." She moved closer to examine his collection, and he found himself oddly nervous about her judgment. The books were an eclectic mix: poetry by Whitman and Longfellow, philosophy, a few novels, technical manuals on farming and animal husbandry, and a worn copy of the Bible that had been his mother's. Not the library of an educated man, perhaps, but more substantial than most frontier cabins could boast. "Milton," she said, running her finger along the spine of Paradise Lost. "I wouldn't have expected to find him in the wilderness." Found it in a burned-out cabin about 10 miles north. Previous owner had no more use for it. He paused, then added, "Seemed a shame to let good words go to waste." She pulled the volume from the shelf and opened it to a passage he'd marked with a pressed flower. "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," she read aloud, then looked at him with new interest. "Is that your philosophy, Mr. McCall?" Eli McCall. He realized he'd never told her his name. "And no, ma'am. I'd say a man makes his own heaven or hell, regardless of where he finds himself. A pragmatic view." She returned the book to its place with careful reverence. "I have a worn Bible among my things. It was my grandmother's, and she marked passages that spoke to her during difficult times. The mention of her belongings reminded him of the small bundle he'd salvaged from her cloak, a few personal items wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived her flight through the storm. He'd set them aside without examining them, respecting her privacy even in unconsciousness. "Your Bible survived," he said, "along with a few other things. Wrapped them in dry cloth by the door." Gratitude transformed her features, making her seem younger and more vulnerable. "Thank you. I was certain I'd lost everything." She retrieved the bundle and unwrapped it, with the careful attention of someone handling precious relics. The Bible was there, as he'd said, along with a small leather purse, a silver locket, and what looked like a train ticket. She palmed the ticket quickly, but not before he caught a glimpse of elegant script and an official seal. "Your grandmother was a woman of faith," he asked, nodding toward the Bible she held. "The strongest woman I ever knew." Clara's voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "She raised 7 children on a farm in Ohio, buried 2 husbands, and never lost her conviction that the Lord had a plan, even when that plan seemed incomprehensible to the rest of us." Sounds like a wise woman. She was. She used to say that sometimes the Lord sends us into the wilderness not to punish us, but to prepare us for something we're not ready for yet. Clara looked around the cabin, her gaze taking in the rough walls and simple furnishings. "I wonder what she'd make of my current circumstances. Probably say you're exactly where you need to be." Their eyes met across the small space, and for a moment, the careful walls they'd both constructed seemed to thin. There was something in her gaze that spoke of shared understanding, of recognition that they were both people who'd learned the value of solitude and the cost of trust. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass, until the wind outside chose that instant to rattle the door with particular fury, reminding them both of the storm that held them captive and the world that waited beyond these walls. By the 3rd day, the storm had settled into a grim pattern of relentless snowfall and bone-deep cold. The wind had calmed somewhat, but the snow continued to fall with the steady persistence of something that had no intention of stopping. When Eli peered out the window that morning, he could barely make out the outline of the woodshed 20 feet away. The familiar landmarks of his domain had vanished beneath a white shroud that transformed the world into something alien and dangerous. "How much snow do you think has fallen?" Clara asked, joining him at the window. She'd fashioned a shawl from one of his spare blankets, and it gave her an almost rustic appearance that contrasted sharply with her refined features. 3 feet, maybe more. Hard to tell with the drifting. He pointed toward where his woodpile should have been visible. "See that white mound there? That's my chopping block. Usually comes up to my waist." The implications hung unspoken between them. This wasn't just a winter storm anymore. It was the kind of blizzard that could trap people for weeks, that turned cabins into islands in an ocean of white. Eli had prepared him for such eventualities, but his preparations had been for one person, not 2. "How long do storms like this usually last?" she asked, and he could hear the carefully controlled concern in her voice. "Hard to say. Seen them blow through in a day, seen them settle in for a month." He moved away from the window, unwilling to feed whatever fears she might be harboring. "We'll manage." But privately, he was running calculations that didn't add up favorably. Food, fuel, water. Everything would have to be rationed more carefully now. The beans and salt pork that had seemed adequate for one man through the winter would stretch thin, feeding two people, especially if this storm lasted as long as his instincts suggested it might. Later that morning, he fashioned a pair of crude snowshoes from branches and leather strips, knowing he'd need to check his snares and possibly hunt if they were going to have enough meat to last. The work gave him something to focus on, besides the way Clara moved through his space with increasing familiarity, or the way her presence had begun to feel less like an intrusion and more like something he'd been missing without knowing it. "Those are remarkably ingenious," she said, watching him weave the final strips of leather through the wooden frame. Necessity tends to sharpen a man's creativity. He tested the binding, ensuring it would hold under his weight. "Learned to make these during my first winter up here. Nearly starved that year before I figured out how to move through deep snow." "Your first winter," she repeated thoughtfully. "So you haven't always lived like this?" It was a gentle probe, the kind of careful question that invited confidence without demanding it. He found himself wanting to answer, to share something of himself with this woman who seemed to understand the value of silence as well as words. "No. Came up here about 3 years ago, after—" He paused, surprised by how close he'd come to revealing more than he'd intended. "After I decided I needed some distance from civilization. And before that, ranching mostly, some farming. Served in the cavalry for a while." Each fact felt carefully measured as he spoke it, chosen for what it revealed and what it concealed. Nothing too interesting. She nodded as if she understood the boundaries he was drawing, the careful geography of topics that were safe and those that remained forbidden. It was a dance of disclosure that spoke of her own experience with secrets and the need to guard them. That afternoon, while he was outside checking the storm's progress and ensuring their water supply remained accessible, Clara did something that surprised him. When he returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots and grateful for the warmth that greeted him, he found her sitting by the fire with his copy of Whitman's poetry open in her lap. "Do you mind?" she asked, gesturing to the book. "I found myself hungry for good words. Read whatever you like." He hung his coat on the peg by the door and joined her by the fire. "Find anything worth the time?" Instead of answering directly, she began to read aloud, her voice giving life to words he'd read countless times in solitude. "When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures, were ranged in columns before me." Her voice was clear and strong, trained for public speaking perhaps, and it filled the cabin with a richness that made the familiar words seem new. As she read, Eli found himself watching her face, noting the way her expressions changed with the rhythm of the verse, the way her eyes lit up at particularly beautiful passages. There was something deeply intimate about sharing poetry in the midst of a blizzard, something that spoke to hungers neither of them had acknowledged aloud. When she finished the poem, silence settled between them again, but it was a different kind of silence now, warmer, more companionable, touched with possibilities neither dared name. The fourth morning dawned clear and still, the storm finally exhausted after its days of fury. Eli woke to the profound silence that only comes after. A blizzard when the world seems to hold its breath, and even the wind takes pause. Sunlight streamed through the window, brilliant against the pristine white that covered everything as far as the eye could see. Clara was already awake, sitting up in the narrow bed with her knees drawn up, writing in a small leather journal she'd produced from her belongings. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, catching the morning light, and there was something peaceful about her concentration that made him reluctant to disturb the moment. "Good morning," she said, without looking up from her writing. "The storm has passed." "Seems so." He moved to the window, assessing the new landscape. The snow had sculpted familiar terrain into strange, flowing shapes. Drifts reached nearly to the cabin's eaves in some places, while other areas had been scoured almost bare by the wind. "We'll be digging out for a while, though." She finished whatever she was writing and closed the journal, holding it against her chest like something precious, I keep a record of my thoughts, she explained. My grandmother encouraged the practice. She said that putting words on paper helped clarify what the heart was trying to say. Wise woman, your grandmother. She was. Clara's smile held both fondness and sadness. She'd have liked you, I think. She always said the best measure of a man was how he treated those who had nothing to offer him in return. The comment stirred something uncomfortable in Eli's chest. He'd helped her because it was the decent thing to do, but her words suggested depths of meaning he wasn't sure. He was ready to examine. I should check the snares, he said, reaching for his snowshoes. See if anything was foolish enough to be moving during the storm. May I come with you? The request surprised him. It's rough going out there. Deep snow, uncertain footing. I need to move, to feel the sun on my face. I've been caged in comfort before, Mr. McCall, and I know the danger of letting walls become too familiar. There was something in her voice that spoke of experience with confinement, voluntary or otherwise. He studied her face, noting the determined set of her chin, the way her grey eyes held steady under his scrutiny. I can fashion you some snowshoes, he said finally. But you wear what warm clothes I can spare, and you don't wander off. This country doesn't forgive mistakes. An hour later, they were making their way across the transformed landscape, moving slowly on the crude snowshoes he'd constructed for her. Clara handled the unfamiliar equipment with surprising grace, and he found himself admiring her determination as much as her adaptability. It's beautiful, she said, pausing to catch her breath. The exertion had brought color to her cheeks, and her eyes sparkled with something that might have been joy. I never imagined wilderness could be so honest. She turned to look at him, considering the word. Yes, honest. There's no pretense here, no social machinery grinding beneath the surface. Things are what they appear to be, most of the time. He adjusted his pace to match hers, noting how she favored her left leg slightly. Though even honest country can fool you if you're not careful. They checked 3 snares without success before finding a fat rabbit in the 4th. As Eli reset the trap, Clara watched with the focused attention of someone genuinely trying to learn. You make it look simple, she observed. Practice. Made a lot of mistakes my first year before I figured out what worked. He straightened, securing the rabbit to his pack. Nearly starved twice before I learned to read what the land was telling me. What made you want to learn? Why not return to wherever you came from? The question hung in the cold air between them, more loaded than she probably intended. Eli found himself on the edge of revelation, the words wanting to spill out despite years of careful silence. Sometimes a man needs to prove to himself that he can survive on his own terms. He said finally, that he's worth more than his worst mistakes. Clara nodded slowly, and he could see understanding in her eyes. I know something about mistakes, she said quietly, about the weight they carry and the distance a person will travel to escape them. They walked back to the cabin in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts they weren't quite ready to share. But something had shifted between them during that simple expedition. A recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that they both carried burdens they'd chosen not to name. That evening, as they shared the rabbit stew and watched flames dance in the fireplace, Eli found himself stealing glances at her journal, wondering what thoughts she committed to paper in the privacy of her writing, and whether any of those thoughts might include him. The 5th evening brought confessions born of firelight and shared solitude. They'd spent the day working together, Clara insisting on helping him clear snow from the cabin's roof while he dug paths to the woodshed and privy. The physical labor had tired them both, but it had also created a comfortable intimacy, the kind that comes from shared purpose and mutual reliance. Now they sat before the fire, Clara mending a tear in her dress while Eli worked on a piece of wood with his knife. The shavings curled away from the blade in long, delicate spirals, and gradually the shape of a horse began to emerge from the pine. You're quite skilled, Clara observed. Watching his hands shape the wood with practiced precision helps pass the time. He turned the carving to catch the firelight, smoothing a rough edge with his thumb. Used to make toys for... He paused, the words catching in his throat like a hook snagging on deep water. For whom? She asked gently. The question hung between them, weighted with the possibility of truth or deflection. Eli continued carving, using the rhythm of the blade to steady himself against memories that still had the power to stop his breath. Had a wife once, he said finally, the words coming slowly like blood from a deep wound. She was carrying our child when the fever took her. Was going to be our first. Boy or girl didn't matter. I was planning to carve toys either way. Clara's needle stilled in her lap. I'm sorry. That's a loss that changes everything. Changes a man anyway. He set down the carving and looked into the fire, seeing scenes from another life flickering in the flames. Sarah was... She had this way of making everything seem possible. The future, I mean. Having something to build toward instead of just surviving day to day. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. Smart, funny, patient with my rough edges, saw something in me worth polishing, I guess. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Fool woman thought I'd make a decent husband and father. Perhaps she wasn't foolish at all. Clara's voice carried a warmth that made him look at her directly. Perhaps she simply saw what you couldn't see in yourself. The words stirred something deep in his chest, something he'd thought permanently frozen. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of failure, the certainty that he'd somehow been inadequate to protect the people who mattered most. But hearing Clara speak those words, seeing the sincerity in her grey eyes, he felt the first crack in the ice that had formed around his heart. "What about you?" he asked, deflecting attention from his own raw places. "Family back in Boston waiting for word?" Her face clouded and she resumed her sewing with movements that seemed more aggressive than necessary. Family? Yes. Waiting? Perhaps not. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not continue. But then she spoke again, her voice carefully. "Controlled. I was meant to marry a man of my father's choosing, a business arrangement disguised as courtship, with my consent considered optional. Arranged marriage." The concept seemed foreign to him, something from another century or another culture entirely. Oh, they were careful to maintain the fiction of choice. I was courted appropriately, given time to consider my feelings, invited to express my opinions on matters that didn't actually matter. Her needle moved through the fabric with sharp, precise strokes. But when it became clear that my feelings ran contrary to family interests, consent became less important than compliance. Eli thought of the bruises on her wrists, the fear in her eyes when she'd first awakened in his cabin. "So you ran." I fled, like a coward, in the middle of the night, taking only what I could carry. She looked up from her sewing, and he could see shame warring with defiance in her expression. Not exactly the behavior expected of a lady. Sounds like the behavior of someone who values her freedom more than other people's expectations. Is that how you see it? There was something almost desperate in her voice, as if his opinion carried weight she hadn't expected to grant him. I see a woman who was brave enough to choose uncertainty over a life that wasn't hers to live. He picked up the wooden horse, again running his thumb over the carved mane. Takes courage to walk away from everything familiar, even when familiar isn't good for you. Clara set down her sewing and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. You speak as if you know something about that kind of courage. Maybe I do. Different reasons, same choice. Sometimes the only way forward is to leave everything behind and start again. They sat in contemplative silence, both lost in thoughts, of paths taken and abandoned, of lives left behind in pursuit of something that might or might not prove worth the cost. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, while outside the wind whispered through the pines with the voice of winter settling in for a long stay. The 6th day brought an unexpected gift, a warm wind from the south that set the snow to melting and filled the air with the sound of dripping water. It was too early for true spring, But the mountains sometimes offered these brief reprieves, false promises of warmth that could deceive the unwary into believing winter had loosened its grip. Eli stepped onto the porch that morning to find Clara. Already outside, her face turned toward the sun with an expression of pure gratitude. She'd wrapped herself in one of his spare coats, and the oversized garment made her look younger, more vulnerable, like a child playing dress-up in adult clothes. "I couldn't stay inside," she said without turning around. "After so many days of storm, the sun feels like a miracle." "Feels good," he agreed, though he kept his eyes on the tree line, watching for signs that the weather might change again. In this country, a man learned to be suspicious of gifts, especially ones that seemed too good to be true. But as the morning progressed and the warm weather held, he found himself relaxing into the unexpected reprieve. They spent the day outside, Clara insisting on helping him clear ice from the water barrels and check the cabin's foundation for winter damage. She worked with an enthusiasm that spoke of genuine pleasure in the physical labor, and he found himself wondering what her life in Boston had been like, how constrained she must have felt to find such joy in simple tasks. "In Boston, I was expected to spend my days in parlors," she told him, as they shared lunch on the sunny side of the cabin, "receiving callers, discussing literature and music, practicing watercolors that no one particularly wanted to see. Useful skills for a lady, I was told, though I was never quite clear on what they were useful for." Sounds confining. It was. Like being a bird in a gilded cage, if birds could be expected to be grateful for the gilding. She pulled off her borrowed gloves and flexed her fingers in the warm air. "I used to dream about having calluses on my hands, proof that I'd done. Something real, something that mattered." Eli looked at her hands, noting the small blisters and scrapes she'd earned from their days of shared labor. "Careful what you wish for. Calluses hurt before they toughen." "All the best things hurt before they heal," she replied, and there was something in her voice that suggested she wasn't talking only about hands. That afternoon, while exploring the area around the cabin, Clara discovered a patch of late-blooming wildflowers that had somehow survived the early winter. They were small, hardy things, alpine forget-me-nots that had found shelter in a depression between two rocks. The blue petals were bright against the snow, defiant and beautiful in their improbable survival. "Look," she called, her voice filled with wonder. "How is it possible?" Eli joined her beside the flowers, studying the small miracle of their persistence. "Protected spot. Gets sun most of the day, and the rocks hold heat. Sometimes beauty finds a way, even in unlikely places." Clara knelt beside the flowers, touching one delicate petal with the tip of her finger. "My grandmother used to press flowers. In her Bible, she said it helped her remember that God's beauty persisted even in the darkest seasons." Smart woman. "May I?" She gestured toward the flowers, and when he nodded, she carefully picked a small handful, handling them as if they were made of spun glass. "I'd like to preserve them somehow, as a reminder." "Of what?" She looked up at him, her grey eyes holding depths he was only beginning to fathom. "Of this, of finding something beautiful when I thought everything beautiful was lost." The words hung between them, weighted with meanings that reached far beyond flowers and weather. Eli felt something shift in his chest, like ice breaking on a spring river, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that included more than simple survival. That evening, Clara carefully pressed her wildflowers between the pages of her journal, and Eli found himself thinking about permanence, about the human need to preserve moments of beauty against the inevitable passage of time. They sat closer together than usual as they watched the fire, their shoulders occasionally brushing, and neither pulled away. "The weather won't hold," he said eventually, breaking a silence that had grown comfortable. "This is just winter taking a breath before the real cold sets in." "I know." She closed her journal and held it against her chest. "But it's been beautiful while it lasted." "Yes," he agreed, though he wasn't entirely sure they were still talking about the weather. "It has." Outside, the wind was already changing, carrying hints of the cold that would return with the night. But for now, in the warmth of the cabin with Clara beside him, Eli allowed himself to believe that some beautiful things might prove more durable than the mountain weather that had brought them together. The seventh morning shattered their fragile peace with the sound of horses moving through snow. Eli heard them first, his soldier's instincts dragging him from sleep with the sudden alertness of a man accustomed to danger. The rhythmic crunch of hoofbeats was unmistakable, growing closer with the steady persistence of men who knew exactly where they were going. Clara was already awake, sitting bolt upright in the narrow bed with her face pale and her eyes wide with a fear that confirmed his worst suspicions. She'd been expecting this. "How many?" she whispered, as if speaking to. Loudly might draw the riders directly to their door. Eli moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight as he peered through the gap in the curtains. 3 men on horseback, picking their way carefully through the snowdrifts toward his cabin. They rode with the confidence of professional trackers, men who'd found what they'd been looking for and knew it couldn't escape. 3, maybe more behind them. He turned back to Clara, noting how she'd gone rigid with terror. "Friends of yours?" "No." The word came out as barely a breath. "Men my father hired. Pinkerton agents, I think, or something similar. Pinkerton." The name carried weight even in the wilderness. Reputation for relentless pursuit that made wanted men sleep badly and honest folks lock their doors. If Clara's father had hired professional manhunters, it meant this wasn't just about family, disappointment, or wounded pride. There were serious stakes involved, serious enough to justify the expense of tracking one runaway daughter across half the continent. "What aren't you telling me?" Eli's voice carried the edge of a man who'd suddenly realized he might be in over his head. Clara's hand went to her throat, where a thin chain disappeared beneath her dress. "My father, he's not just wealthy, Mr. McCall, he's influential. Connected to people who don't accept defiance, especially from women." "What kind of connected?" Before she could answer, a voice called out from the yard, clear and authoritative. In the morning stillness, "Miss Byrne, we know you're in there. Come out peaceable-like, and nobody needs to get hurt." Eli felt the familiar coldness that came with combat, the way time seemed to slow, and his vision sharpened to focus on essential details. His rifle was across the room, loaded but not immediately accessible. The men outside would be armed and prepared for resistance. Clara was unarmed and terrified, a liability in any confrontation. "Miss Byrne," the voice came again, closer now, "your father's worried sick about you. Time to come home." Clara stood slowly, her movements deliberate despite the fear written across her features. "I have to go with them," she said quietly. "If I don't, they'll what?" She pulled the chain from beneath her dress, revealing a heavy signet ring that caught the morning light. The design was intricate, clearly expensive, bearing what looked like a family crest surrounded by symbols Eli didn't recognize. "This ring represents more than just family wealth," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It's connected to business interests, political alliances, things that stretch far beyond Boston. My marriage wasn't just about securing my future. It was about consolidating power, creating connections that would benefit certain enterprises." "What kind of enterprises?" "The kind that don't tolerate loose ends or family members who might know too much about activities that should remain private." The implications hit Eli like a physical blow. Clara wasn't just a runaway daughter, she was a potential liability to people with the resources and ruthlessness to eliminate problems permanently. The men outside weren't here to bring her home for a family reunion. They were here to ensure her silence one way or another. "Miss Byrne," the voice had taken on an impatient edge, "we're not leaving without you. Make this easy on everyone." Eli moved toward his rifle, his mind already calculating angles and distances, possibilities and odds. 3 men, possibly more. Professional killers, most likely, despite their polite words and reasonable tone. Clara behind him, frightened but determined, carrying secrets that powerful men wanted buried. "No," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Mr. McCall." "No." He took down the rifle, checking the action with movements made, smooth by years of practice. "You came here for sanctuary, and sanctuary is what you'll get. Those men want to take you away from here. They'll have to go through me first." Clara stared at him with something that might have been wonder. "You don't understand what you're risking. Maybe not, but I understand what's right." He looked at her directly, seeing the woman who'd helped him remember what it meant to care about someone other than himself. "And letting them take you without a fight isn't right." Outside, the voices were growing impatient, and Eli could hear movement as the men positioned themselves around the cabin. "You don't know what you're saying," Clara whispered, her voice urgent with desperation. "These aren't ordinary men, Eli. They're killers, and they work for people who make problems disappear permanently." But even as she spoke, she was reaching into her belongings, pulling out something that made Eli's blood run cold. The signet ring she'd shown him was only part of the story. Now she revealed documents, official papers bearing seals and signatures that spoke of connections reaching into the highest levels of government and business. "My father isn't just wealthy," she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He's part of a consortium that controls shipping, railways, mining interests across 3 states. They've been moving money, making deals, eliminating competition, in ways that would destroy them if the wrong people found out." Eli stared at the papers, recognizing enough of the legal language to understand the scope of what she was describing. "And you know about this because I was educated to be the perfect wife for the perfect business alliance. I speak 4 languages, understand international finance, and I was privy to conversations that most women never hear." Her laugh was bitter. "They trained me to be an asset, then were surprised when I developed inconvenient principles." "How?" "Inconvenient? I discovered that the man they wanted me to marry, Charles Whitmore, has been using his position in the territorial government to facilitate land deals that displaced entire communities. Families forced from their homes so that mining operations could expand. Railway routes chosen to benefit certain investors while destroying others." She clutched the papers against her chest. "I have documentation of bribes, false surveys, murders, made to look like accidents." The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted her revelation. The Pinkerton agents were growing impatient, and Eli could hear them testing the door, assessing the cabin's defenses. "Miss Byrne," came the voice again, but this time there was steel beneath the politeness. "We know you're frightened, but your father sent us to bring you home safe. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Clara moved to the window, staying out of sight, but positioning herself where she could see their pursuers. 3 men, as you said, but there's something else. They're not just tracking me. Look at their saddlebags." Eli joined her at the window, following her gaze to where the horses stood ground-tied in his yard. The saddlebags were bulky, too large, for simple travel provisions. One of the men was checking something that looked suspiciously like surveying equipment. "They're not just here to take you back," he realized. "They're mapping the area. My father's consortium has been looking for new mining opportunities in this region. If they can claim that I was killed by hostile terrain or wild animals, they can also claim discovery rights to any valuable land I might have explored before my unfortunate demise." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Clara's flight hadn't just been about escaping an unwanted marriage. She'd stumbled into the middle of a larger conspiracy, one that reached far beyond family politics into the realm of territorial control and resource exploitation. Her knowledge made her dangerous, and her death would serve multiple purposes for men who thought in terms of problems and solutions. "How much do they know about this place?" Eli asked. "Enough to find it, but probably not enough to know about your military background or the defensive advantages this cabin offers." She looked at him with something that might have been hope. "You were cavalry," you said. "That means you know about fighting outnumbered." "Some." He moved away from the window, his mind already working through tactical possibilities. "But 3-to-1 odds against professionals. That's not a fight you take unless you have no choice." We don't have a choice. If they take me, I'll disappear. Permanently, and you—" She gestured around the cabin at the life he'd built in this remote valley. "You'll become a witness who needs to be eliminated." Outside, the voices had stopped. In the sudden silence, Eli could hear the subtle sounds of men positioning themselves for an assault. The creak of leather, the soft jingle of spurs, the whispered coordination of professionals who'd done this before. "There's something else," Clara said quietly, reaching beneath her skirt to produce a small derringer. "I'm not as helpless as I might appear. My grandmother taught me that a lady should always be prepared to defend her honor." Eli stared at the tiny pistol, then at the woman who held it with surprising steadiness. "How many other surprises are you carrying?" "Enough," she said simply. "The question is whether we can survive long enough to use them." The silence outside stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the soft sounds of men moving into position. Eli's military training kicked in with the familiar clarity that came under fire. Assess the situation, identify assets and liabilities, formulate a plan that maximized chances of survival. "How much ammunition do you have?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Enough for the rifle, plus my sidearm." He moved quickly to his gun cabinet, retrieving a Colt revolver that had seen service in 2 wars. "But if they're professionals, they'll try to avoid a prolonged gun battle. Too much noise, too much chance of complications. What will they try instead? Smoke us out, most likely. Set fire to the cabin, force us into the open." He checked the loads in both weapons, his movements precise and economical. "Question is whether they want you alive or just want the problem solved permanently." Clara's face went pale at the implication, but her voice remained firm. "Given what I know, alive is probably preferable only until they can extract information about who else I might have told. Then we make it too expensive for them to take you at all." Eli moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, gathering items that could serve as weapons or tools. A hunting knife went into his belt, along with a hatchet that could serve double duty. He pulled down the heavy iron skillet that could stop a bullet if positioned correctly, and gathered every container that could hold water. "What can I do?" Clara asked, clearly fighting against the helplessness of inaction. "Stay low, stay quiet, and be ready to move when I say move." He paused in his preparations to look at her directly. "And if something happens to me, you take that derringer, and you make sure they don't take you alive. These aren't the kind of men who show mercy to inconvenient witnesses." She nodded, her grey eyes reflecting a steel he was beginning to recognize as fundamental to her character. "Eli, there's something I need to tell you before—" "Tell me after," he interrupted. "Right now, I need you focused on staying alive." But she reached out and caught his arm, her touch stopping him mid-motion. "If we don't survive this, I want you to know that these past days, finding you, being here, it's been the first time in my life I've felt truly free." The words hit him like a physical blow, stirring emotions he'd thought permanently buried. For a moment, the tactical situation faded into background, and all he could see was this remarkable woman who'd stumbled into his life and somehow made him remember what it felt like to care about something beyond mere survival. "Clara, I know it's foolish," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know we barely know each other, that circumstances have thrown us together in ways that might not, but I need you to know that whatever happens, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope." Before he could respond, the sound of splintering wood came from the rear of the cabin. The Pinkertons had apparently decided that negotiation was over, and they were testing the building's structural weak points. Eli moved to the back wall, pressing his ear against the logs. He could hear at least one man working on the chinking between the logs, probably trying to create a gap large enough to insert some kind of incendiary device. "They're going to try to smoke us out," he confirmed. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before this place becomes uninhabitable." He looked around. The cabin that had been his refuge for 3 years, noting details he'd never expected to see for the last time. The books on their rough shelves, the simple furniture he'd built with his own hands, the stone fireplace that had kept him warm through countless lonely nights. All of it would be ash before the day was over, but strangely, the thought didn't bring the pain he'd expected. Instead, looking at Clara crouched beside the window with her derringer in her hand and determination written across her features, he felt something he'd almost forgotten, the fierce protectiveness that came with having something worth fighting for. "There's another way out," he said, making a decision that would have seemed impossible just days ago. "Root cellar has a tunnel that comes up about 50 yards into the tree line. Built it my first winter, in case I ever needed to escape quickly. Then we run, and we lead them away from here into country where they don't have the advantage." He moved to the loose floorboard that concealed the cellar entrance. "But once we go down there, there's no coming back. This place, this life, it's over." Clara looked around the cabin once more, then back at him. "Some things are worth more than the safety of familiar walls." Outside, the sounds of preparation continued. Soon, very soon, they would be forced into the open. But for now, in these last moments of relative safety, Eli allowed himself to believe that some gambles were worth taking, especially when the alternative was losing the best thing that had happened to him in years. The root cellar was cramped and dark, smelling of earth and stored vegetables, but it represented their only chance of escaping the trap his cabin had become. Eli lifted the heavy wooden trapdoor, revealing rough-hewn steps that descended into blackness. The space below was barely tall enough for a man to stand upright, carved from the living rock during those first desperate months when survival had demanded every innovation he could devise. The tunnel runs northeast, following a natural depression. "In the rock," he explained in whispers, aware that sound could carry through the cabin floor above them. "It comes out behind a screen of boulders about 60 yards from here. From there, we can reach the tree line without being seen." Clara nodded, her face pale but determined in the dim light filtering down from above. "What about supplies? Food? Ammunition? There's a cache hidden near the tunnel exit. Not much, but enough for a few days if we're careful." He gathered the few items they could carry: his rifle, the extra ammunition, Clara's small bundle of personal belongings, and a knife that had belonged to his father. Everything else would have to be abandoned. As they prepared to descend, Clara suddenly reached for something she'd tucked into her dress. It was a thin gold band, worn smooth by years of handling, that she'd kept hidden until now. "This was my grandmother's wedding ring," she said quietly. "The only thing of real value I took when I left Boston." She held it out to him, her grey eyes serious. "I want you to have it." "Clara, I can't. Not as payment for helping me. As a promise." Her voice carried a weight that made him understand this was about more than simple gratitude. "My grandmother always said that love was about choosing to build something together, even when the world seemed determined to tear it apart." Eli stared at the ring, understanding the magnitude of what she was offering. Not just a piece of jewelry, but a commitment to something that neither of them could clearly define, something that had grown between them in the space of a week that felt like a lifetime. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Once we go down there, once we run together, there's no going back to the lives we had before." "I've never been more sure of anything." She pressed the ring into his palm, her fingers warm against his skin. "I spent 25 years living the life other people chose for me. These past few days with you are the only time I've ever felt like I was choosing my own path." Above them, they could hear the Pinkertons moving around the cabin, testing windows and doors, preparing for their final assault. Time was running out, but Eli found himself reluctant to break this moment, this quiet space between decision and action, where hope still seemed possible. "There's something I need to tell you too," he said, slipping the ring into his vest pocket, where it settled against his heart like a talisman. "That first night, when you collapsed on my doorstep, I thought you were going to die, and the idea of losing someone else, of failing to protect someone who needed help. It nearly broke me all over again. But you didn't fail. No. But more than that, taking care of you, having someone to worry about besides myself, it reminded me what it felt like to be alive instead of just existing. He reached out and touched her face gently, marveling at the softness of her skin, the trust in her eyes. You brought me back to life, Clara. Whatever happens up there, I need you to know that. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes briefly. Then we survive this together, and we build something worth surviving for. The sound of splintering wood from above ended their moment of quiet intimacy. The Pinkertons had apparently grown, tired of waiting, and were beginning their assault in earnest. Smoke began to filter down through the floorboards, acrid and thick, confirming Eli's prediction about their tactics. "Time to go," he said, helping Clara down into the narrow tunnel. The space was barely wide enough for them to move single file, carved through solid rock with tools that had left rough marks on the walls. It was cramped, uncomfortable, and completely invisible from above, exactly what they needed. As they made their way through the darkness, guided by touch and memory, Eli could hear the sounds of destruction above them. Glass breaking, furniture being overturned, the crash of his carefully built life being systematically dismantled. But instead of grief, he felt something unexpected: relief. The weight of the past was being burned away, leaving space for something new to grow. Behind him, Clara moved with quiet determination, her breathing steady despite the confined space and the danger they faced. In the pocket of his vest, her grandmother's ring pressed against his chest, a reminder of promises made and futures yet to be written. They emerged from the tunnel into cold mountain air and the pale light of afternoon, free but far from safe. The real test was just beginning. They emerged from the tunnel behind a screen of granite boulders, exactly as Eli had promised. The cache he'd mentioned was there, a waterproof container buried beneath a cairn of stones that held jerky, hardtack, and extra ammunition. Not much, but enough to keep them alive while they put distance between themselves and the men who wanted Clara dead. The cabin was visible through the trees, smoke now pouring from its windows as the Pinkertons' fire took hold. Eli felt a pang watching 3 years of careful construction go up in flames, but it was overwhelmed by grim satisfaction. Let them think their quarry had died in the blaze. It would buy precious time. "We head for the high country," he whispered, shouldering his rifle and checking the loads in his revolver. "There's an old mining camp about 10 miles north, abandoned, but the buildings are still solid. We can fort up there, make them come to us on ground we choose." Clara nodded, her derringer held ready despite its limited range. "How long before they realize we're not in the cabin?" "Not long. They'll search the ruins, won't find bodies, and then they'll start looking for other ways out." He studied the terrain ahead, plotting a route that would keep them concealed while making good time. "Question is whether they know this country well enough to track us effectively." Their answer came sooner than expected. As they worked their way up the slope through scattered pines, a shout from behind told them their escape had been discovered. The Pinkertons had found the tunnel entrance, and they were already in pursuit. "Move," Eli commanded, and they broke into the ground-eating lope that mountain men used to cover long distances over rough terrain. Clara kept pace despite her unfamiliarity with the country, her determination making up for what she lacked in experience. Behind them, voices echoed through the trees, professional, coordinated, closing the distance with the relentless efficiency of trained hunters. These men knew their business, and they had the advantage of horses until the terrain became too rough for mounted pursuit. The first shot came when they were still half a mile from the mining camp, the bullet clipping bark from a pine just inches from Eli's head. He spun, rifle ready, and saw movement in the trees below them. Range was long, but not impossible. "Keep moving," he told Clara. "I'll slow them down." "I'm not leaving you. You're not leaving me. You're getting to safety so I can do what I do best without worrying about crossfire." He was already settling into a firing position behind a fallen log. "Go, I'll be right behind you." Clara hesitated for one precious second, then nodded and continued up the slope. Eli waited until she was clear, then began the deadly game he'd learned during the war, precision shooting designed to make enemies cautious, to slow their advance, and cost them the momentum that was their greatest advantage. His first shot took the lead Pinkerton in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling into the snow. The man's companions immediately sought cover, their rapid advance slowing to a cautious crawl. Eli used their hesitation to fall back to a new position, keeping them pinned while Clara gained ground toward the mining camp. But these weren't ordinary men, and they adapted quickly to his tactics. While two of them engaged him in a careful long-range duel, the third began working his way around the flank, using the terrain to stay out of Eli's line of sight. The flanking movement forced Eli to abandon his position and run, but he'd bought Clara the time she needed. When he reached the mining camp, he found her already positioned in the main building, a solid log structure that commanded excellent fields of fire in all directions. "3 of them, maybe more," he reported, checking his ammunition. "They're good, but they're not mountain fighters. We've got the advantage of position and local knowledge. What do? We make it too expensive for them to keep trying." He moved to a window that overlooked the approach route. "They want you alive, which limits their options. We don't have the same constraints." The assault came just as the sun touched the western peaks, casting long shadows across the abandoned camp. The Pinkertons tried a coordinated rush, counting on speed and superior numbers to overwhelm the defenders. But Eli had chosen his ground well, and Clara proved surprisingly effective with her derringer at close range. The battle was brief, but vicious. When the gun smoke cleared, 2 of the attackers were down, and the third was retreating toward the tree line, clearly having lost his appetite for what was supposed to have been a simple retrieval operation. "Is it over?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the violence they'd just survived. "For now." Eli reloaded his weapons, still watching the forest for signs of movement. "But they'll be back, probably with reinforcements. We can't stay here." Clara looked out at the wilderness that stretched endlessly in all directions, then back at the man who'd risked everything to protect her. "Then where do we go?" "West," he said simply. "As far west as we need to go to find a place where your father's money can't reach." She smiled then, despite everything they'd lost and everything they still faced. "Together?" "Together," he confirmed, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Spring came late to the Oregon Territory, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it the kind of hope that made even the hardest winters seem worthwhile. Eli stood on the porch of their new cabin, watching Clara tend the garden they'd planted together in the rich soil of the Willamette Valley. The land here was gentler than the Wyoming mountains, more forgiving to those willing to work with it, rather than simply endure it. 6 months had passed since they'd fled the mining camp. 6 months of careful travel and cautious optimism as they'd made their way west, through territories where Clara's father's influence couldn't reach. They'd married in a small town in Idaho, the ceremony performed by a circuit preacher who'd asked no questions about their past and cared only that they spoke their vows with genuine conviction. The hand-forged wedding bands Eli had crafted from gold Clara had sewn into her dress caught the morning light as she worked among the young plants. Simple circles of metal, but they represented something more valuable than all the wealth and power her family had tried to use to control her destiny. "The beans are coming up nicely," she called, straightening to wave at him. The months of frontier living had changed her, adding strength to her frame and confidence to her bearing. But her smile still had the power to make his heart skip like a schoolboy's. "Good soil here," he replied, though they both knew he wasn't really talking about agriculture. "Good place to put down roots." Clara walked over to join him on the porch, soil still dark under her fingernails, her hair escaping from its pins in the way that had become familiar and dear. "Any regrets?" she asked, the question that had become a ritual between them. "None," he answered, as he always did, pulling her close and meaning it completely. You? Only that it took me so long to find the courage to choose my own path. She leaned against him, solid and warm and real, though I suppose the path led me exactly where I needed to be. In the distance, a neighbor's dog barked once and fell silent. Somewhere a meadowlark sang its liquid song, the ordinary sounds of a life built on hope rather than mere survival, a future they were writing together one day at a time. They'd heard no word from the Pinkertons since Oregon, no sign that Clara's father had extended his reach this far west. Perhaps he'd written off his wayward daughter as a loss, or perhaps the vastness of the frontier had finally proven larger than even his considerable influence. It didn't matter. What mattered was this moment, this place, this woman who'd stumbled into his life during a blizzard and taught him that some kinds of love were worth any risk. "Come on," Clara said, taking his hand. "Those beans won't plant themselves, and we've got a future to grow." Together, they walked back toward the garden, toward the life they were building with their own hands in soil that belonged to no one but themselves. Behind them, the cabin stood solid against the sky, a testament to the enduring power of hope and the courage to begin again.